Do you think Plato is just an image of a sage with a white beard? And I will say that he called for the prohibition of poetry and art because he considered them copies of copies that lead the people to error. He considered art a propaganda tool with the help of which elites and tyrants maintained their power, controlling the thoughts, desires, and actions of the population. He said this 2,400 years ago. In his ideal state, women were to study and serve in the army along with men. At the same time, he believed in reincarnation and believed that those men who sinned a lot in a previous life are reborn in the bodies of women, and that's that their punishment is to be born in a weaker body. So who was Plato? Let's find out. Chapter 1. The main reasons why people still remember Plato. Plato is still remembered not just as a great thinker, but as a figure whose work has survived for millennia and laid the foundation for all of Western philosophy. The scope and depth of his dialogues have made them indispensable textbooks on metaphysics, ethics, and politics, and they are still studied and applied today. Plato's dialogues cover topics ranging from metaphysics, such as the works Timaeus and Parmenides, to politics, his main work, The Republic. He also distinguished himself in the field of ethics. His most famous works are Phaedo and Gorgias. Thus, Plato created a holistic system of thinking in humanities that no other ancient author had achieved. He became a prominent figure of his time and the entire era of antiquity thanks to his school. His Athenian Academy was founded around 387 BC and lasted until 529 AD. The school ceased to exist only because in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, Christianity became the state religion in the 4th century, and the depiction and dissemination of non-Christian beliefs began to be increasingly persecuted and repressed. Ancient schools were also banned, in particular the school of Plato. This is one of those examples of how tectonic geopolitical shifts can affect people's culture and lives. However, prior to this, Plato's text had been continuously copied for almost 900 years. For comparison, a country like the United States is 250 years old. The school of Plato played an important role in forming the canon of valid works, rejecting the Apocrypha. Apocrypha in the ancient context were texts of dubious origin or authorship, which were sometimes attributed to famous names, such as Plato or Aristotle, to increase the weight of their ideas. The Academy played the role of a caste of philologists and philosophical experts who supported the canonical Platonic and Neoplatonic texts by systematically rewriting authentic manuscripts and rejecting apocryphal forgeries. In other words, in a modern sense, the school of Plato played the role of a licensed primary source. Due to the prohibition of philosophical schools by Justinian I, it is believed that a significant number of Plato's works were lost. The surviving works include about 36 dialogues and some works in fragments. During the Islamic Golden Age, 8th to 13th centuries, Muslim scholars played a key role in preserving and transmitting Greek philosophy, including Plato's works. In Europe, Plato began to be studied again only in the Renaissance. In the 15th century, the Florentine Renaissance made Platonic philosophy a fashionable subject again. In 1484, Marsilio Ficino published a complete Latin translation of all the dialogues, which launched a new wave of commentary and study in European universities. Thus, the combination of the unique depth of Plato's ideas, an organized school with a long tradition of rewriting, translating, and commenting across cultures, and the elements of accidental manuscript preservation have ensured Plato a place in history that almost no other contemporary has ever achieved. For example, if Plato's ideas and teachings had not been honored simultaneously in ancient European and Muslim cultures, his memory would hardly have survived the geopolitical upheavals that followed the fall of the ancient world, the split of Rome, the fall of the Roman Empire, and the spread of Christianity. While Plato's teachings were banned in Europe, he was studied and revered in the Arab Muslim world. And when the Renaissance began in Europe, he returned after 1,000 years, and his ideas remained relevant. It's amazing. Chapter 2. Interesting facts about Plato. Below is a collection of unexpected, poignant, and even spicy facts about Plato, from his personal life to the curiosities of his historical fate. 1. His real name is not Plato. According to legend, his birth name was Aristocles, which translates as highest glory, and Plato, broad, was his nickname, allegedly because of the broad shoulders he gained in the struggle or because of the breadth of his oratorical style. 2. Aristocratic roots and noble origin. On his mother's side, Plato was a descendant of the legendary lawmaker Solon. On his father's side, perhaps he was in the genealogy of the two mythical kings Aristocles and Codrus. 3. poetic youth, and the act of self-immolation. In his youth, Plato wrote dithyrambs, lyrics, and even tragedies, but after meeting Socrates, he allegedly burned all his own poetic works as unequal to true philosophy. 4. Professional wrestler and young glamour man. According to legend, Plato won wrestling championships in Athens and even wore earrings and rings as a sign of his position and taste, for which Epicurus criticized his too bright life. 5. Captivity and ransom in Sicily. During his second trip to Syracuse at the invitation of the tyrant's uncle, Plato fell out of favor, was imprisoned, and then sold into slavery. He was rescued by the philosopher Anaxagoras of Cyrene, who ransomed him for 20 minas. According to the Attic standard, 1 mina equals 435 grams of silver. So 20 minas is about 8.7 kilograms of silver. At the current exchange rate, this is approximately $9,000. 6. Founding of the first university school. Around 387 BC, near the sacred grove of Acadia in honor of the hero Acadius, Plato opened his academy, the first permanent institution of higher philosophical education, which lasted for about 900 years. 7. Platonic love is not about sex. Although we today call relationships without sex platonic, Plato himself never used this term. In the Symposium, he described the ascent from carnal desire to higher-level love and beauty, the basis of what would later be called Platonic love. 8. Scandalous letters that are still in doubt. The so-called seventh letter of Plato has come down to us, where he reveals the political intrigues of Syracuse and personal motives, a long-standing historical subject of debate about the authenticity and moral and political corruption of the elites. 9. Epigraphs pseudo-biographies. Some epigrams and short poems attributed to Plato are considered late forgeries, apocrypha, which almost spoiled his biographical image for several centuries. The Last Night to the Sound of the Flute. According to the philosopher Philodemus, confirmed by the recent decoding of the Herculaneum papyrus, Plato died at the Academy. When a young flutist was playing for guests, he allegedly complained about her unfortunate rhythm and fell asleep forever. Chapter 3. Plato's contribution to science, culture, and civilization as a whole. Plato laid the fundamental foundations for the development of not only philosophy, but also many sciences, education, and political culture, creating a living tradition of dialectic and school that has shaped European thought for more than 2 millennia. He identified the method of questioning, dialectic, the idea of eternal forms, which influenced mathematics and natural science, and founded the first permanent school of higher education, the Academy, where mathematics, astronomy, and music were studied. Contributions to science. 1. The idea of eternal forms in mathematics. Plato believed that true knowledge comes from incorporeal forms, ideal patterns, such as the perfect circle or square, that laid the foundation for the development of geometry and the theory of mathematical structures. His famous inscription above the entrance to the Academy, "Let no one who is not familiar with geometry enter here," attests to the early integration of mathematics into philosophy and scientific research. 2. Astronomy and natural science. In the Timaeus dialogue, Plato formulated cosmological ideas about the harmonious structure of the universe, laying the foundation for further models of the celestial spheres. Although modern astronomers have rejected his geocentrism, Plato thought the sun revolved around the Earth. Researchers have found surprises. For example, in 2020, scientists discovered that the average rock fragmentation approaches a cubic shape, proving Plato's cubic idea of soil blocks. 3. Interactive method, dialectic. The method of Socratic dialogue developed by Plato in his written dialogues became the prototype of modern scientific discourse, where arguments are tested by counter-arguments and counterexamples. Contribution to culture. 1. Literary craftsmanship and art theory. Although Plato himself criticized poets in the Republic, his dialogues, structured as dramatic scenes, established the genre of dialogue and literary criticism, as well as the idea of catharsis as purification through art. 2. Ethical and political legacy. In the Republic, Plato laid down the concept of the philosopher king, the utopian model of the ideal state, and ideas of justice that influenced political thought from the Middle Ages to the modern era. 3. Contribution to civilization. The Neoplatonist Plotinus, Proclus, systematized Platonic ideas into large-scale philosophical schools that found their way into Christian theology, Thomas Aquinas, and Muslim philosophy, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina. Plato's belief in reason and idealism set the intellectual tone for the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries, stimulating the search for the true forms of nature through experimentation and mathematics. Thus, Plato's legacy is not just a philosophy, but a holistic system of knowledge and values that encompasses science, education, art, and political culture, and has influenced the development of Western civilization for over 2,400 years. Chapter 4: 10 Main Ideas in which Plato was wrong or even expressed absurdity. Below are 10 of Plato's most controversial ideas, which modern science and philosophy consider to be false or absurd. 1. Geocentrism. In the Timaeus, and more broadly in ancient cosmology, Plato considered the Earth to be the fixed center of the universe. Today, this model is rejected. It has been replaced by the heliocentric system of Copernicus and the mechanistic physics of Newton and Einstein. 2. At the age of 17, Aristotle went to Athens, where he entered the Academy, a philosophical school of Plato. Aristotle stayed at the Academy for 20 years, first as a student and later as a teacher of rhetoric. He retained a deep respect for his teacher for the rest of his life, and wrote that a bad person cannot even praise Plato. 3. Innate ideas, theory of memories. Plato believed that the soul saw the forms before birth, and that learning is simply remembering. Modern cognitive science does not confirm any previous experience of the human soul. Cognition is formed on the basis of sensory data and neural processes. 4. The abolition of the family and the state. Plato's idea was to abolish the private family and hand children over to the state to raise them as a common property. Perhaps he took such a position partly because he did not have children of his own. Psychologists and sociologists unanimously condemn this social engineering as destructive to human emotional development. Was Plato the first communist? 5. The prohibition of poetry and art. In the Republic, Plato bans Homer and all poets, saying that they mislead people with copies of copies. He also opposes writing, claiming that it causes forgetfulness rather than true memory. 6. The idea of a philosopher king. Plato believed that only philosophers should rule, since only they have knowledge of the truth. Practical critics, from Karl Popper to modern psychologists, show that no expert group is free from cognitive biases, and the total power of philosophers leads to totalitarianism. 7. The anti-writing argument. In the Phaedrus, Plato, through Socrates, speaks out against writing. If you put knowledge on paper, it will cease to live in your soul. Today we know that writing is the key to preserving and transmitting knowledge, and the development of science is impossible without written records. 8. The myth of subordinate women. Although in the Republic Plato allows women to rule, at the same time in a number of dialogues, he describes them as emotionally unstable and less rational. Modern gender theory and psychology refute all arguments about the natural inferiority of women. 9. The cosmology of the Timaeus, the four elements as polyhedra. In the Timaeus, Plato associates the four elements with the Platonic solids, cube, earth, icosahedron, water, etc. Modern geologists and chemists consider such geometric correspondences to be overly simplified and devoid of experimental basis. 10. Utopian totalitarian justice. Platonic ideal state is rather a cruel, elitist machine. The division of people into castes, strict censorship, forced participation of citizens in serving the state. Karl Popper called this the first step towards totalitarianism and contrasted it with an open society of free exchange of ideas. These errors and absurd notions demonstrate how complex and contradictory the figure of Plato was. At the same time, he laid the foundations of Western thought and gave rise to a multitude of ideas that had to be radically revised. Chapter 5. What were Plato's political and ideological views? Who would he be in the modern world? Was he a socialist or a capitalist? What was his political coordinate? Which of the modern thinkers and experts, politicians, is he similar to in his views, taking into account the difference in epochs? Let's look into it. In the state, he described a three-tiered hierarchy: philosophers king as the only bearers of true knowledge, soldiers as defenders, and producers, artisans, peasants, which corresponds to an authoritarian approach to power. He advocated common property and common education only for the ruling class of guards, while leaving private property to the rest of society. Thus, Plato's ideology combines elements of collectivism for the elites and market motives for the rest. In modern terms, this can be called an authoritarian center with elements of socialism for the ruling class and authoritarian communism for ordinary citizens. For Plato, the ideal is a philosopher-ruler who rules for the common good and not for personal gain, combining elements of paternalism and expert power. For the soldiers' guards, Plato supported the idea of joint ownership and joint upbringing of children in the state to avoid corrupt family ties. In other words, children who were to become soldiers' guards in the future were to be taken from their parents and given to the state for upbringing. At the same time, producers, farmers, artisans were to retain private property, which stimulated their pragmatic labor and production of goods. Thus, its economic model is a kind of hybrid of socialism for the elites and market capitalism for ordinary citizens, something similar to the USSR, only the classes are reversed. For example, Philosopher King is an analog of the party elites of the USSR with their hierarchical structure, where all rulers ruled the state until their deaths, with the exception of Khrushchev. The soldiers' guards are the KGB and the army. All other citizens are ordinary workers without the right to private property, without the right to conduct commercial activities, and without the right to free expression censorship. The main difference is that in Plato's case, it was the philosopher kings who were supposed to live collectively, while ordinary citizens workers were supposed to have private property. If we talk about analogies with modernity, Plato is closer to state technocrats like Lee Kuan Yew Singapore or moderate collectivists like former German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Lee Kuan Yew Singapore is a strong technocratic authoritarian leader who combines strict governance with high levels of welfare and a clear hierarchy. Angela Merkel, Germany, a centrist conservative with elements of social responsibility, although less authoritarian, but close to Plato's mixed solutions in the field of economics. Friedrich Hayek is not a direct analog, but his criticism of full state ownership echoes Plato's arguments about the need for private property for workers. Thus, Plato combines strict authoritarianism with socialist elements for the ruling class and market mechanisms for the rest of society. In today's world, he would be a technocratic patriarchal leader or a centrist with elements of social protection, combining rigidity of governance with a pragmatic approach to the economy. Chapter 6. What was Plato's social status at birth and in old age? How did his career develop in general? And what were the main catalysts for his growth? Plato was born around 428/427 BC into an influential Athenian aristocratic family. His father Ariston claimed descent from the last king of Athens, and his mother, Pericles, was a descendant of a lawgiver Solon. From an early age, he received a classical education in grammar, music, gymnastics, and rhetoric, and in his teens he became a student of Socrates, a relationship that gave him his first intellectual authority and formed his philosophical foundations. At the same time, he repeatedly gathered for banquets and symposia, mentioning that one should not lose the joys of youth. His contemporaries also described the philosopher's love of drinking and feasting. He did not deny this, and even in his old age recalled the revels of his youth as the best moments of his life. Despite his friendly relations with many influential families, Plato himself was never married and had no children, as evidenced by the absence of references to marriage in the sources. After the execution of Socrates in 399 BC, Plato retired from political activity in Athens and, seeking to put his ideals into practice, made his first trip to Syracuse. But his attempts to become an advisor to the tyrants ended in failure, and he returned to Athens without any achievements. After returning a few years later, Plato went to Syracuse for the second time about 20 years later, but fell out of favor with the tyrant and was arrested. According to ancient descriptions, he was even sold into slavery until his philosopher friends bought him back for 20 minutes of silver. After these defeats, Plato finally withdrew from politics and focused on teaching. In about 387 BC, he founded the Academy, the first permanent center of higher education in the Western world, where philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and music were studied. The Academy grew steadily for several decades, attracting students from many different countries and providing Plato with lifelong material wealth and unquestioned social authority. In his old age, he was still the head of the Academy and was honored by both the Athenian elite and foreign visitors. He spent his last evening in his own home with his students, listening to the flute play. Plato died in 348/347 BC, leaving behind a lasting educational tradition and a legacy that has influenced philosophy and science for 2.5 millennia. Key catalysts for growth. Aristocratic background provided access to quality education and connections in government. Socrates' teaching gave him authority among the Athenian intelligentsia. The failed Sicilian expeditions became a lesson and at the same time made him famous outside Athens. The founding of the Academy cemented his role as the king of philosophers in the European tradition. The failures were primarily two unsuccessful attempts to reform Syracuse, and as a result, Plato finally gave up politics in favor of pedagogy and systematic recording of his own dialogues. Chapter 7. How did Plato treat and speak about women? In his dialogues, Plato demonstrated a contradictory attitude towards women. On the one hand, he argued that women could perform the same duties as men if they received the same education, which is in line with modern academic ideas about gender roles, gender differences, and the importance of education and access to social elevators. On the other hand, he wrote about their natural weakness, their tendency to the corporeal, material, and sinful, and even believed that unjust men were reincarnated as women after death. In the state, he allowed women to serve in the military, own weapons, and share the wealth of the state, but still considered them weaker. This was a rather progressive view for the time. In the Timaeus, he mentioned the female nature as a gloomy and cold force that is below the male warmth and intelligence. Perhaps this is where Aristotle, a student of Plato, got infected with the absurdity of male warmth and female coldness. See the previous video. Plato believed that the female species comes from the earth and the male from the sun. Woman is a gloomy, cold, material element. In the work Symposium, the role of women is reduced to the mythological figure of Diotima, an emotional guide to carnal love, and real women are limited to beautiful flute players as an element of spectacle and entertainment. In the Republic, Plato bans poets and art because women and illiterate slaves are too much influenced by works of culture and fiction, and as a result, regulate their behavior not by the requirements of the common good, but by their temporary whims, false ideas, and temptations. Modern feminists would condemn Plato not only for these general syndromes of female inferiority, but also for his direct calls to limit women's participation in politics, for his belief that women's nature is inherently unreasonable and subordinate to the bodily, and for his identification of women with low feelings and unstable emotions. Chapter 8: The Generation of Artificial Intelligence. Who would Plato be in the 21st century? Plato, with his distrust of democracy, his belief in the rule of the wisest, and his ideal of a philosopher king far from the rule of the masses, would have been more inclined to a limited, elitist form of government. In the context of the current American bipartisan choice, he would rather sympathize with the Republicans for their centralization of power and skepticism about populism and excessive freedom, and would criticize the woke movement and similar left-liberal forces. At the same time, he would also express quite a few points of view that are more similar to what modern Democrats stand for. Gun control. He would have supported stricter restrictions on weapons, as he believed that only soldiers and guards, who are subordinate to the state and have the right to own weapons, should have weapons. According to sociologists, today 58% of American adults favor stricter gun laws, and Plato would have considered this a necessary element of radical moderation. Healthcare. In the laws, Plato emphasizes policies that take care of the physical well-being of citizens, so he would have approved a system of universal health insurance with elements of state regulation to avoid an oligopoly of the rich in the medical field. Plato would have favored a public healthcare system with a limited private sector, somewhat similar to the current practice in the European Union. Today, the United States spends 17.8% of GDP on healthcare, but has a lower life expectancy than other European Union countries, which for Plato would be an example of unjust laws. Immigration. Plato recognized hierarchy, but at the same time believed that foreigners who were talented and able to work could be accepted into the city-state if they proved their integrity. Today, immigrants make up 14.3% of the U.S. population, and Plato would have appreciated a rigorous test of language and morality as philosopher king. In this aspect, it is more similar to the political views and course of modern republicans. Climate. In the Timaeus, Plato considered nature to be the work of a demiurge, and the state was supposed to protect this reasonable order. Therefore, he would have supported the EPA's methane reduction rules and other environmental protection measures, EPA, new methane standards, seeing them as the legislative embodiment of a philosophical duty to protect the cosmic order. Economic justice. Plato and the Republic laid down the ideas of equality of opportunity and moderation of wealth between the guardians and the producers, so he would have advocated progressive taxation of the excess profits of the richest 1%. He would have seen this as a mechanism of golden mean between oligarchy and democracy. Criminal justice. In his Republic, Plato was one of the first to address the issue of not only punishment, but also the re-education of criminals. Harsh punishments were justified as a means of fostering justice. Plato would have supported reforms that combined rehabilitation with clear laws, including reducing recidivism through education in prisons. Foreign policy. Plato believed that the city-state should awaken the good in other nations. In today's world, he would approve of U.S. programs to support democracy and human rights like USAID, but would criticize aggressive military interventions without a philosophical consensus of Congress. Balance of power. As in the laws, he would have insisted on allying himself with the wisest politicians, for example, cooperating strategically with democratic allies and maintaining deterrence against authoritarian regimes to preserve the interstate order. What policy would Plato pursue in 2025 in relation to China, Russia, Israel, Iran, and Ukraine, taking into account his philosophy and the ideological and strategic subtleties of today? China. Plato would have recognized that any nation-state should seek mutual benefit while protecting its own interest. Therefore, he would have favored continued trade with China, but demanding a competition of laws and a fair distribution of benefits. At the same time, he would have insisted on clear rules for intellectual property and technological exchange, as the wisest should guide the process of cooperation, not natural markets. Russia. Plato would have condemned aggression as a violation of justice between city-states. He would have supported the continuation of sanctions against the Russian energy sector and the introduction of new measures together with the Allies until Moscow agrees to fair negotiations. At the same time, sharing the carrot-and-stick policy, he would have put pressure on the Kremlin with sanctions, and in case of a demonstration of readiness for peace, he would have started an open dialogue, in which Plato's approach is very similar to Trump's. Israel. Plato would have considered Israel a critical strategic ally, one that is consistent with his notion of a strong center of law and order. However, referring to the principles of solidarity within the state from the Republic, he would have condemned unilateral actions that restrict Palestinian rights and actively supported a peace plan based on equality before the law. Iran. In his dialogues, Plato favored reasonable diplomacy. He would have supported the nuclear talks in Oman, noting that Iran's limited nuclear status must be accompanied by strict international verification, and only then could sanctions be eased. This approach is in line with his idea of a mixed constitution, a balance of power and law. Ukraine. For Plato, the defense of Ukraine's sovereignty would be a matter of internal justice for the enslaved. He would have supported the continuation of military and financial aid until Russia agreed to a just peace. In the future, he would have insisted on Ukraine's inclusion in a mixed union, with a clear set of responsibilities and rights, a kind of politics, between Western democracies to guarantee the sustainability of peace. At the same time, Plato would have strongly condemned the closure of borders and the forced mobilization of men in Ukraine. In the Republic, Plato clearly distinguishes between classes of citizens. Only the guards have the right and duty to defend the city-state. He would have considered the massive blocking of travel and forced mobilization of civilian men in Ukraine a violation of their natural purpose and an unlawful mobilization of unqualified citizens. He would have supported the temporary suspension of the electoral process, as Zelensky has done. However, he would have insisted on clear time limits and legal procedures for the transition of power to avoid a tyranny. He would also have supported the censorship that the Zelensky government has introduced during the war. This keeps morale up and sows unity, but not a total blocking of independent media, because he valued public debate as a test of arguments. Plato in the Laws sees corruption as a disease of the public soul, proposes strict laws against bribery and abuse of power. Therefore, he would have condemned the spending of American tax dollars if they went to corrupt officials and demanded a transparent mechanism for auditing aid and legal accountability for the theft of public resources. Plato in the U.S. of 2025 would be a voice for a limited democracy where the wisest have power through clearly written laws, stricter gun regulations, universal regulated healthcare, controlled immigration, active climate policy, progressive taxation, and rehabilitative prison reforms. In foreign policy, the promotion of democracy, but through a philosophical consensus, without populist interventions. This would be a logical projection of his philosophy of justice, order, and integrity to the contemporary American context. Plato's financial and property wealth in terms of modern money. Plato, born into a noble Athenian family, had considerable wealth, which allowed him not only to conduct philosophical research but also to found his own school, the Academy. Plato owned an estate in Ephistia, a suburb of Athens, which he bequeathed to a relative named Adamantius. In classical Greece, land was the main source of wealth. For comparison, the famous politician Alcibiades had 28 hectares of land, which was considered a significant possession. Assuming that Plato had a similar size estate, his wealth can be estimated at about $5 to $10 million at current land prices in the suburbs of Athens. In addition, Plato financed the Academy, which did not charge tuition, indicating that he had additional income or savings, most likely family, inherited income, and voluntary donations from admirers. Thus, his total net worth could reach $10 to $15 million in today's equivalent. Media weight and modern social networks. Plato was one of the most influential thinkers of his time. His academy attracted students from all over the Greek world, including Aristotle. In the modern context, this can be compared to the influence of leading intellectuals or popular educational platforms. If Plato had lived in our time, he probably would have. YouTube, 5 to 10 million subscribers on a channel with lectures and discussions. Twitter, X 2 to 3 million followers, where he would share philosophical quotes and commentary on current events. Instagram, 1 to 2 million followers, depicting moments from academy life and philosophical reflections. LinkedIn, a profile with 1 million followers where he would publish articles and analytical materials. His influence can be compared to contemporary figures such as Yuval Noah Harari or Jordan Peterson, but with a greater depth of philosophical analysis and an emphasis on ethics and politics. Which contemporary politician would Plato support in 2025? If Plato lived in 2025 and was eligible to vote in the U.S. election, his political preferences would be very different from modern democratic standards. His philosophy, particularly his criticism of democracy and the idea of a government of philosophers, suggests that he would not have supported any of the major U.S. political parties. Plato considered democracy to be a dangerous form of government because it allowed the uneducated masses to make important decisions, which could lead to chaos and tyranny. He believed that only philosophers with knowledge and wisdom were capable of governing a state fairly and effectively. In a modern context, Plato would probably favor a system where power is vested in experts and educated leaders rather than elected by a popular vote. This may be similar to the concept of an epistocracy, rule by the educated. On a scale of 0 to 100, Plato would have supported. Of today's politicians, Donald Trump, Republican Party, 20 points out of 100. Plato would probably criticize Trump for his populism and appeal to the emotions of masses, which contradicts his ideal of rational government. Kamala Harris, Democratic Party, 40 out of 100. Although Harris supports social justice, Plato might have considered her politics too mass-oriented and insufficiently philosophical. Peter Buttigieg, Democratic Party, 60 out of 100. His intellectual approach and education might have been respected by Plato, although the democratic process of election would still be problematic. Ron DeSantis, Republican Party, 30 out of 100. His strong leadership tendencies could partially meet the Platonic ideal of order, but his lack of philosophical depth would lower his score. In general, Plato, as a thinker who strived for the ideal of justice and wise government, would probably not support any of the modern political parties in the United States. He would advocate a reform of the political system, focused on the rule of educated and virtuous leaders, which corresponds to his concept of the philosopher king. Most likely, under the current system of electoral law, and with a pair of candidates Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, Plato would not have gone to the polls. Attitudes to modern movements. Plato would have been against woke activism because he would have considered it a tool for controlling and manipulating certain social strata. If we were to choose between the polar movements of modern feminism and the traditionalist Andrew Tate, Plato would not have supported either of the first or the second. Although ideologically, he is quite close to the feminism of the first and second waves. After all, he defended the rights of women and believed that with a proper level of education and training they could perform all the same roles as men, including military service and state administration. But he would most likely consider the modern third wave of feminism a dirty tool of political struggle and manipulation of the least informed and emotionally vulnerable masses, which will ultimately be used by elites and tyrants, by analogy with the modern world, corporations, and political leaders. That's the kind of man Plato was. What are Plato's ideas close to you, and will you disagree with him on? It will be interesting to read your opinion. If you liked it, put a like and subscribe. This will help promote the channel. I will continue to try. We have many more interesting stories and characters in the queue. By the way, you can write in the comments about who else should make such a lecture analysis, which can be comfortably listened to before going to bed, while cooking, with headphones during training, or in the car on the way to work. I am happy to try for you, and my effort is to make the content both interesting and useful at the same time. This is one of the principles of happiness, which Professor Tal Ben-Shahar spoke about in the Harvard course of lectures on the psychology of happiness. I hope to see you in the next videos.